Welcome to NYLA 2020 On Demand. This session was previously recorded for the NYLA 2020 virtual conference. It is available to you through December 31st, 2020. Please note, once viewed, each on-demand program is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. Links to materials and presenter contact information have been archived in a Google folder and are made available after conference. Support files and documents can be found in session files below the program description. Any questions about the NYLA 2020 virtual conference digital platform can be directed to Christina@nyla.org, or you can call 800-252-6952. Auditing a School Library Fiction Collection for Diversity is sponsored by Sizzle. Without further ado, our presenters.
I'm Mindy Gray. I am a librarian at the Overlook Primary School in the Arlington Central School District.
And I'm Jaclyn Heeney, also a librarian at the Arlington High School.
And I'm Lucy Miller, librarian at Arlington High School. We're all from the Arlington Central School District, and we're really glad that you decided to join our presentation today. The seeds of this presentation were sown at Fall Into Books in 2017, which is a Mid-Hudson Valley conference, when Tara Tebow and I sat down to talk about our concern for students in the wake of the Charlottesville protests and our great desire to bring together school librarians in Dutchess and Ulster counties just to discuss what we could do to support and empower our students. Working groups formed in both counties to discuss our options. I also participated around that time in a segment of a library journal course that led people through a diversity audit. I introduced this to our working group, subsequently renamed a PLN, and we decided as one component of what we were doing to offer a course in diversity fiction auditing through Dutchess County BOCES, and that took place in the fall of 2018. Half a dozen Dutchess school librarians spent time auditing their collections. When we came together at the end of that 6-week course to discuss, everyone agreed that the process had been worthwhile and had changed their perception of their collections and their roles in one way or another. So we're here to give you an understanding of the audit process, and we hope to give you a sense of why you might want to audit your collections too. We chose this quote from Rudine Sims Bishop to highlight the conviction that drove us to audit and which continues to drive us to improve our library programs in ways that will benefit all our students. So, what is a diversity audit? When we started exploring this topic a couple of years ago, the process was novel, at least to us, and I think to a lot of librarians. But that was a while back. Many of you may be familiar with the concept. There are multiple possible approaches to conducting an audit, and there are all kinds of potential participants you can bring into the process. At Arlington High School, one of our favorite parts of this was bringing in students to help us, and featured here are 2 National Honor Society students from AHS who helped audit the books, and they learned something in the process about the publishing industry and how far diversifying our collections really needs to go. So here is the guru who started us on this trek. Karen Jensen is a young adult public librarian in the Midwest who blogs at Teen Librarian Toolbox and also maintains a very active Twitter presence. If you haven't read Karen's posts about her YA fiction collection diversity audit, please do so. I mean, in fact, you could leave the presentation now, ignore us, just read what she wrote and be well on your way to your own audit by the end of our time slot. But I do hope you'll choose to wait and hear what we have to share. Karen provides a phenomenally detailed step-by-step procedure freely available online at Teen Librarian Toolbox. Each of the school librarians who participated in that course through BOCES adapted this process in one way or another to their own needs.
Okay, so I don't think I need to convince you why we need diversity in our library collections, but we do think it's important to just pause and acknowledge upfront that a white, cisgender, able-bodied, and heterosexual is our default in society. That is the assumed in society and publishing. And when I think about that, I like to frame it and think of the opposite. So white as opposed to black or brown, cisgender as opposed to transgender, able-bodied as opposed to disabled, heterosexual, homosexual. So the default's assumed in TV, books, films, and beyond, that the audience is white, hetero, etc. This is what a person, what we picture in our minds when we think of someone. You often, in reviews or in conversations, people might mention when someone is gay or black. So diversity is the imperfect umbrella term used to bring perspectives other than that assumed neutral into focus. So our goal is to make our collections as inclusive as possible with a wide variety of points of view, experiences, and representations. Next slide. So with that being said, diversity really should be called our reality. We live in a country in which nearly 40% of the population is non-white, and 51% of our school-age population is also non-white. Next slide.
But we live and work in a profession that's at the intersection of a whole lot of whiteness. In 2010, 88% of US librarians were white. 2015-16, 80% of teachers were white. And in 2015, if you look at publishing, 82% of editors, 87% of publishing executives, and 89% of book reviewers were white. So when I say intersection, all of that is us in one way or another, are we not? We are teachers, we are librarians, and we are sharing the books. So I hope you'll forgive me for taking some time to explore the history of white and even more specifically, white female librarianship. Okay, here is my friend Lady Bountiful. Librarianship, like any other profession, really started out as a male job. Librarians were men. When did that change? Well, when we started to get wave after wave of immigrants coming into this country, these new arrivals were seen as needing a civilizing influence. And the idea came up of training women to take on the roles of librarians, and specifically to be librarians to children, because it was thought that that civilizing female influence could be really conveyed beautifully to students through story time. So you get a white woman into these neighborhoods where immigrants lived, and their job was to, quote unquote, civilize these children, to bring and Americanize them, to bring American civilization to children through stories. And we are maintaining that tradition today. This highlights something that's still really rampant in education as well, which is deficit thinking, the idea that we're looking at our students to see what they lack and change what they're lacking. It's not the only way to look at education. Okay,
So here we've landed in this predicament of a world of white, cisgender, heterosexual, neutral. and a profession that is whitewashed. So how can we as librarians make a difference? Regine Bishop Simmons was mentioned earlier, and she was a professor at Ohio State University, began her career in the 70s by researching how Black children were represented in children's literature. She began auditing children's literature for not only that representation, but also how Black people were being represented. In 1990, she wrote an article and came up with a wonderful metaphor of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And in it, she uses that metaphor to describe the relationship and experiences that readers have with books. So books can be a mirror to our own experiences, or they can be a window into the world of others. Also, with sliding glass doors, readers can walk through to become part of the world that the author has introduced. As librarians, our goal is for every person, child or adult that walks into our library should be able to walk over to the shelves and casually pull a book that might mirror their experience. When I think about this concept, I think about my own experiences as a librarian, and recall a moment in time where I read a book about the Day of the Dead, which was a beautiful book that I read to second graders. And after I read that book, a little young girl came up to me and was beaming and so excited and telling me that she celebrated the Day of the Dead with her family. And it was a very memorable experience as a librarian. And it was really exciting that this young girl had that affirming mirror for herself. But with that being said, we really want to avoid the 5 F's. And if you can go to the next slide. So the 5 F's are food, fashion, festivals, famous people, and flags. And these 5 things are often used to bring out culture, and we really do want to avoid these. So like was mentioned, the example that I mentioned, we want to make sure that that was not the only book that I presented to my students on Mexican heritage and culture. Next slide. So if we think about, again, going with the concept of mirrors and windows, this exercise really became personal for me. And as I was exploring the metaphor and doing the diversity audit and thinking about it, I'll just start and say that, you know, I am white, I'm cisgender, and I'm a lesbian. And so growing up, I didn't have any books that reflected my feelings or experiences. It was the age of don't ask, don't tell. So homosexuality was still being very much hidden. There weren't a lot of people at that time, at least in my world, that were out. And so during this audit, I remember coming into work one day and being just so excited about reading Kiss Number 8, because this was a really good mirror for me. This was the main character had feelings for her best friend, and Tomboy is a great book about a young girl who doesn't fit into gender norms. And just reading those 2 books, even later in life at, 40 something years old, I can say that that experience was very affirming. And if I had those books as an adolescent or early, young adult, it really would have given me permission to explore my identity more. Perhaps maybe would have prevented me from feeling so much shame. And so I really encourage all of you to think about what your mirrors were as a young adult, and also what windows, what books have you read, did you read that gave you a window into other perspectives. Next slide. So if we look at current windows today, Angie Thomas is a very popular young adult author, and she's also an own voice author, which means she writes about characters in marginalized communities, and in her case, it is her Black community. And The Hate U Give was very, very popular 2 years ago. My niece read it, and that would be considered her window. But discussing the book with her, I was very concerned with our conversation. She had concluded that this character must have lived in the past, and she couldn't quite understand how someone would face racial discrimination in 2020. It's very heavy for me to say that out loud. You know, this was 2 years ago, before the George Floyd tragedy. And so my hope is that young white girls like herself are a little more aware of the issues that Black Americans face, but it shouldn't have to take a tragic event like that one to make young people aware of race issues. Some of these issues are beyond the scope of our profession, but what we can do is offer more windows. And Lucy's going to comment on the come up.
So after writing her second book, On the Come Up, Angie Thomas found herself being characterized as an issues writer. And when we look at The Hate U Give, we can certainly see that that book is focused around the issue of police brutality. There's a teenager murdered, and that drives the entire narrative. On the Come Up is a different book. On the Come Up, to me, was a beautiful story about family ties and connections, the connections that make a family and a community. And I have to ask that how often are books about kids living lives with their families in an affluent white community, and we know that communities are Black or white because of government policies throughout the last century. How often is a novel that's written about a kid in an affluent white community, which comes with its own set of innate issues? We just heard a little bit about that from Jaclyn. When is that characterized as an issue book? When it's a problematic characterization, and I think it plays back to this question of who is the default human in our culture? If you're not white and cishet, well, then there's an issue. And also plays into what I mentioned about deficit thinking and looking at those unlike ourselves as lacking something that we have. So if we do recall that default, that white privileged cisgender default, we can see why her books can sometimes be landed as, oh my goodness, sometimes are characterized as issue books, but it's really diminishing her artistry and what she's doing. We want to see the full humanity of Black, Indigenous, person of color characters and not see them as representing an issue. Move on.
So these are statistics from the Cooperative Children's Book Center, which is part of the University of Wisconsin. And the CCBC began documenting the number of books by Black authors in 1985, when they discovered they were trying to see who would be eligible for the Coretta Scott King Award, and discovered that only 18 books were created by African Americans in that year. So they thought it would be important to begin documenting this. In 1994, they began documenting books by Asian Americans and added on to the list. So if we just are reading the data, in 2014, out of the 3,500 books received by the Cooperative Children's Book Center, 85 were created by African Americans, while 181 were about African Americans. So because of efforts like We Need Diverse Books, the percentage of books about people of color has increased. In 2018, the number of books created by African Americans went up to 5.5%, which is better. If we look at books about Latinx, that has also increased from 1.8% in 2014 to 6.8% in 2018. But if we consider the United States population, 17.8% of the US population is Latinx. So being that 6.8% are being represented in our books, that's not enough. If we go to the next slide, I like to look at the United States population and do some comparisons. So with a society that's 40% non-white, if we look at the percentages that reflect that, what I came up with was only 27.9% of books actually represent non-white people. And what I did was I added up all of the numbers of diverse books, and out of it was roughly 3,683 books received by CCBC. That was the number, 27.9% reflect a narrative that's non-white. Hispanic and Latinos are far below any other minority group, and I thought that was worth noting. And also a few notes about the statistics. The number of books that they document each year created by authors and illustrators who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color does not represent the number of individual book creators in those categories. So oftentimes a single individual will have written a number of books. Also to note is that CBBC does not document own voice novels. Next slide.
So we learned a lot of background before we got started, and part of that, so there was the national background, the publishing background, but we also needed to get some specifics about our own school in order to make decisions about what was most important to our community, or what might be. So you can see here, we learned with one quick graph that Arlington High School is a pretty white place. And every time I look at this slide, and that doesn't matter how many times I've looked at it rehearsing for a presentation, every time I look at this slide, I get shocked again. I feel disbelief. To me, our school looks pretty diverse. Kids come into the library, all sorts of kids. I look around, I feel kind of pleased about it. Feels like a classic American tossed salad. That's me, middle-aged white lady librarian. Our students of color must feel very differently when they look around. And many report that they do. They're very aware of being small minorities in the school and the repercussions of that. This demographic report just shows us a few broad categories. For example, how many Jewish students do we have at our school? I don't know, beats me. But it gave us a good start, and it certainly gave me an iPhone. So we finally get to our audit.
All right, so after looking at our demographics, we did sit down and discuss all the categories that Jensen laid out in her article. We had very lively discussions about these categories as we were grappling with wanting to represent all various forms of diversity. In the very beginning, I actually was having discussion about including a separate category for cultures or a specific country within a race. If you think, for example, the umbrella of Asian or Asian Pacific, it includes a wide variety of cultures, including Middle Eastern identities, like Pakistani or people from Jordan, Vietnam, China. Knowing that these countries have different cultures, it bothered me that these were all clumped into one. But at the end of the day, we needed something manageable, and we had to kind of move on from that. We did find it necessary. We wanted to make sure we had 2 categories for African American. So we had one for historical representation and one for current. That was important to us. We also had a neuroatypical category, which included people that are autistic, ADD, dyslexia, etc. And also thinking about socioeconomic diversity, that was also included in our audit. So if we go to the Excel sheet, you can see our categories. And how do we make decisions about how something would get marked? Lucy and I decided that the main character must represent that race or category, that it could not be a secondary character. There are other ways, that's how we did it. You can make a different choice. So what we did here, how did we get this Excel sheet? How do we get all this data into the Excel sheet? We exported our collections. So ultimately we decided to do our fiction collection. We did a standard audit of all of our fiction. And we actually have our fiction collection is in genres, but so we had to fix the data a little bit there. We exported and put it into Excel. And we did use Google. We used Google Sheets because we were asking students and our staff to engage with us in the audit. We needed a document that we could share. We did learn later on that we really needed Excel to play with our data, to sort it. It just seemed much easier to use Excel. So we did end up shifting that. So we did a full audit on our fiction collection. We did use a random number generator, which is really cool. And if you look on column A, you can see that's how we got to our, that's what gave us our numbers. And you could see what's highlighted is the titles that we were auditing. Our average audit time was about 5 minutes per book. And we use book reviews to determine the categories. And we found that was sufficient. Occasionally, we would go to the shelves and grab the book, but generally, we used book reviews. Next slide.
Okay, let's look at the audit from a primary school perspective. I'm going to talk about how and why I did, what I learned from my data, and issues that arose, and how those results are driving me to do better. We can go to the next slide. This is my demographic at Overlook Primary School. I used these broad categories as my categories for the audit. I would like to note, like Lucy said, when I walked into Overlook Primary School 6 years ago, it seemed like the most diverse, I mean, it didn't seem like it, it is the most diverse school that I've worked at in my 23 years in the Arlington Central School District. Yet you can see that it is a predominantly white school. So going into my audit, I did expect to find that I would have more books with a white main character. We can go to the next slide. To start my audit, I set a sample size of 100 picture books, starting with the letter A. So I did 100 from A, 100 forward. And I generated a random list of 25. And these were the first 13 books that I came across. Very few, none fit my category. I was pretty shocked by this. In fact, the word Lucy used is disbelief. I knew the librarian that worked before me. She was very conscious of her diverse population. I know myself that I'm aware of it, that when I order books, I'm looking for books with characters of color and books by authors of color. For example, I know that I have all of Angela Johnston's books, Jerry and Brian Pinkney's books, Jaclyn Woodson's books. So I decided that there was a flaw in this 100 book sample, 25 random books, that possibly I needed to look at my entire picture book collection. So I abandoned the sample size, started at the letter A, went all the way through to Z of my 3,000 picture books, title by title, pretty quickly, just looking at the cover for a main character. I recorded on my sheet the category that they fit. And again, I use the categories of my demographic for the school demographic. Okay, Lucy, next slide. And this is my graph. You'll see that I have, it doesn't, barely makes the list. There are 8 books with an American Indian or First Nation character, 39 for the Latinx category, 74 African American main characters, 62 Asian Pacific Islander, 515 white. Still pretty shocking, but remember, I expected to find a lot of books with a white main character. Okay, we can go to the next slide. When you look at my data, so the graph on the left, that's my books. When you look at my data against my student population, the gaps are larger than half. My Asian students make up 5% of my school, but I only have 2% represented in books. My African American students, 9% of my population, only see themselves in books 3%. My Latinx population, the second largest population in my school, 14%. Now this almost looks like the data that Jaclyn showed earlier, but in my books, less than 2% have a Latinx main character. So if my goal is to mirror reality, I haven't met it. If my goal is for my students to see mirrors, I haven't met it. And if my goal is to provide windows, I have a lot of work to do. Next slide. Before I can start that work, I needed to acknowledge some significant details that affect my collection and the audit. And I think that this particular, the first one I'm going to acknowledge, is particular to primary schools. Notice that a significant number of books in a picture book collection, in my picture book collection, contain animals or inanimate objects as main characters. You can see in the graph on the left that that's 2,100 books out of 3,000. And the graph on the right shows that that's 75% of my collection. I understand the psychology behind using animals and objects for young children as characters in books for young children, as it does create a buffer or some distance when dealing with a topic that might be touchy or tense, like race maybe, or bullying or disabilities. But characters and objects are also funny, and they're engaging to young children and beginning readers. which makes them popular to publish, and they will sell. But if our hope is for more children to see themselves in books, then 75% of my collection is too high. And to address this, I simply can't sit down and order more books that create inclusiveness in my collection. I'm going to need to do some weeding. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And this infographic supports the data that you saw earlier from the CCBC, only in picture form, but it does show that across children's books in the publishing industry in 2018, the second largest category published was 27% with animals or objects as the main character. So when we go to do our ordering, you know, our options, it's our second biggest chunk of books that we'll see, which leads me to my next slide, which is the second detail that I need to address. We can go to the next slide. And the second detail that I need to speak to is my ordering practice. Like most busy librarians, I rely on best of lists. However, upon reflection, I see that books in best of lists aren't always the best way to do this. And they present some of the same issues with demographic percentages and animals and objects as characters that my collection shows. For example, in the school library journal, Best Books for Young Readers to celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, there were 6 books that were labeled for my grade, K2. 3 out of the 6 had animals as the main character. The same takes place in the 37 Kidlit titles to honor Hispanic Heritage Month. There were only 5 books in that list that were for my age group. However, all 5 of those books did have humans as the main character. And in the best picture book list of 2018 from Kirkus, there were 78 books on the title. 21 had a main character of color. 26 had an animal or object as the main character. 31 for white. So in order to deal with this, I need my ordering practices to be more targeted, and you'll see some of the resources that we use for that at the end of the presentation. My next slide. This third, I'm going to speak to the way that I actually did my audit. I counted every book in some way, and this originally included historical representation of characters of color, and I'd actually like to go back and separate that out to know how many books I have that are historical representation and how many books I have that are showing characters in a modern or an authentic portrayal. I also didn't note if the book was written by, if the book had a main character of color, was the author of the same culture. And you'll see that in Thunderboy Jr., as compared to The Girl Who Loved Wild Horses, it's The Girl Who Loved Wild Horses is written, or proposed to be a folk tale, but it is not written by anyone from a Native American culture. And lastly, in this third topic of creating more categories, is like Jaclyn and Lucy did at the high school. I did not divide out that Asian Pacific Islander category, which is huge and becomes and includes Pakistan and China and India and Vietnam. And I have students from Albania also. So how are they seeing themselves in a category labeled Asian Pacific Islander? So I'd like to go back and look again. Lastly, moving forward with all of this, I'm using a quote from Maya Angelou: do the best that you can until you know better. So I felt that I was doing the best that I could, but now I know better, so I need to do better.
So there are not only lots of ways to do an audit, but there are lots of places that an audit can be done. It doesn't just have to be in our school libraries. Classroom libraries are a perfect target for a fiction audit. One example of that, at our high school, we shared with teachers what we were doing, and one of our teachers, Julie G., decided that she wanted her students to audit her collection. They chose audit categories after class discussions. She wrote up a Google form for kids to fill out, and then they each took a stack of books and they set through to audit them. Like us, they decided that the criterion would be the main character would be what would count in an audit in any of their categories. So this is the form that she used. This comes from Lee & Low Publishers, which has a whole lot of material for anyone who's interested in auditing, and it's specifically targeted at classroom teachers and even written by classroom teachers, but it can be useful to us as well. So she started with a classroom diversity questionnaire. Her students chose topics to audit, and in just a few days they got through her classroom collection, and she was very happy with her results, unlike me with our results. There are, again, plenty of formats. All ages can participate. This is something that could be used with primary students to audit books. Perhaps they would use the covers of their books to do the audit. And next, another step up, Jessica Lifshitz. You may know her very well from her Twitter presence. She wrote a couple of articles, again, on the Lee & Low library website, publishing website, that detailed the process that she went through with her 5th graders, and this is the form that she used. Within the course that we mentioned, holding through Duchess Bosse's, every librarian, as I said earlier, adapted the process a different way. A lot of people were not comfortable with generating a random sample, so they took their own approach to sample size. Jennifer Simmons pulled every 20th book in her junior fiction section. Somebody else did a reverse audit, which is a completely new, different approach to auditing. Instead of going through your collection and sampling or doing the full collection, you can take a look in your catalog and see what you have for each category. So try to pull out what you have. And then there is the option of checking your collection against lists of award winners. And if you go back to Karen Jensen, she has a huge number of those lists that can be used. I would suggest that as an adjunct to other approaches, because we've already heard Mindy talk about the lists of award winners are a great way to make sure that you have certain books that you should have, but they're not going to get you to the percentages that you might want to see in your collection. And question mark here, because there's always another way to adapt to your needs.
So like what Mindy said, when we know better, we do better. So for us, auditing was really just the beginning. After we went through that process and discovered what we did discover is, that the results of our audit were very bleak. So we wanted to make sure that we went about our ordering and our collection development in a more strategic way. So we started with the resources that we had gathered over the course of the year, and we will share that with you as well. And we agreed that every order we would make from this point forward would focus on diversity. So we, instead of starting with school library journal or book list, we agreed that we would start with resources like We Need Diverse Books, Brown Girl Books, or Latinx Publishing. We also started auditing each order. We did that through one of the vendors that we use. We're able to create notes in our orders and we did one actually audit on one of our orders. And, you know, lastly, our book promotion, which Mindy will talk about as well, is because we're focused on diverse titles, we often find ourselves book talking them and, you know, making a point to put those displays up.
So after going through this audit process, that following June, I did work my way through the catalogs of a couple of Native American First Nation presses and found some high school appropriate, potentially appealing titles to order. I did realize that, and I think each of us is going to emphasize this, those books would need a level of promotion that we don't need when we're ordering the most popular books from the most popular authors. Getting them onto the shelf is not enough. They're going to stay on the shelf without some conscious promotion from us. And I'm going to let Mindy continue, I think.
And yes, I am going to continue and really just re-emphasize everything that Lucy and Jaclyn have said, that my ordering practices were much different than after the audit. They were targeted, and then I audited my order. My book talks have changed so that they include all of my new books with characters of color, but also in any book talk that I'm doing, I make sure that there are characters of color, as well as my read alouds have changed, that I've looked through my read alouds across the year, and I am making sure that I'm including more books with human characters, pulling back from the animal characters. Is just something I think we fall into in primary school, is those animal characters. And my displays, that my displays are intentional and specific, so that when I look up, I am seeing a diverse and inclusive collection.
So we have shared with you some of what we know about auditing. We have a lot more resources available to you, and we'd really like to introduce a couple of them to you now. Mindy, would you like to speak about a couple of the ones that are of interest to you? And then I know Jaclyn.
Yes, I can do that. And the two that I do use quite a lot are the Read Across America site. It's sponsored by the NEA. They offer a calendar now to celebrate diversity across the year. So Read Across America has moved away from celebrating Dr. Seuss into celebrating diverse picture books, and it will list them. They have the 2021 calendar up right now. There's a book for every month, a way to use it, how to introduce it to your students. And then when you see a title, of course, you can think of other titles that you would include with it as a book talk. And teachingbooks.net is a wonderful resource. We have access to that through our Duchess BOCES, and it will allow specific searching, authors, titles, and book lists by grade level. And then you can also create your own lists. It has book trailers, book videos, interviews with the authors, correct pronunciation of authors' names. It is a wealth of information. Those are the two that jump out at me. So if
Jaclyn, do you want to talk about Airtable maybe? Or the particular Airtable?
Yes, it's actually a curated, it's basically an Excel sheet of all of the many diverse presses and different diversity lists out there that I can't remember the person that curated it, but I do believe that it's on our LibGuide. We created this LibGuide when we did the course, and all of our resources are on there, which you'll have access to. I often use the Airtable just because it's all there, and I click and go where I want to go that day.
Yeah, so we do have a guide with you with a lot of resources, which we add to from time to time. One thing that I skipped on the last slide that I did want to mention is that as you get into, and it is here, as you get more interested in looking for own voices titles, Follett actually has a collection that you can pull from. So that is not a bad way to start to build your own or continue to build your own voices collection.
This concludes the NYLA 2020 on-demand program, Auditing a School Library Fiction Collection for Diversity. We hope you continue to take advantage of all the on-demand and live programs the NYLA 2020 annual virtual conference has to offer. Thank you so much for helping us make this the best virtual conference ever.